The smell hit me first, that familiar mix of sweat, old leather, and industrial disinfectant that could only mean one thing. I was home. Well, not home exactly, but the closest thing I had to one for most of my teenage years. I stood outside Tony's boxing gym on East Warren Avenue, watching the October wind scatter yellowed newspapers across the cracked sidewalk. Detroit in the fall always felt like a city holding its breath, waiting for the brutal winter that would test everyone's resolve once again. The gym's faded red brick facade looked smaller than I remembered, squeezed between Mama Rosa's corner store and a vacant lot where the old pharmacy used to be. My name is Marcus Williams, and I'm 35 years old. 10 years ago, I left this neighborhood with nothing but a high school diploma, a head full of dreams, and calloused hands from countless hours hitting the heavy bag inside that building. Today, I was back with a net worth that would make most people's heads spin. But standing here, looking at the peeling paint on the gym's front door, I felt like that angry 15-year-old kid all over again. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent the morning in a glass-walled conference room in downtown Detroit's Renaissance Center, closing a deal that would net my company $3 million. The view from the 40th floor showed the Detroit River stretching toward Windsor, with cargo ships moving like toy boats in the distance. It was the kind of view that made you feel powerful, important. But this view, this narrow street with its potholed asphalt and chain-link fences, this was the view that had made me who I really was. I pushed open the heavy door, and the familiar creak echoed through the dim interior. The sound transported me back 20 years to the first time I'd walked through that same door. I was 15, angry at the world, and convinced that life had dealt me nothing but bad cards. Marcus Williams. The voice came from the far corner, near the speed bags that hung like tired fruit from rusty chains. Tony Ricci emerged from the shadows, moving with the careful gait of a man whose joints remembered every fight he'd ever been in. At 70, he was still built like a middleweight, but his hands shook slightly as he approached, something I'd never noticed before. "Jesus Christ, look at you," he said, his Brooklyn accent as thick as ever, despite 4 decades in Detroit. "You clean up nice, kid. Real nice." I looked down at my tailored suit, suddenly feeling overdressed. "Hey, Tony, it's good to see you." We embraced, and I caught that scent that was uniquely his. Old Spice aftershave mixed with the liniment he used on his arthritic shoulders. For a moment, I was 16 again, getting a pep talk before my first real fight. "What brings you back to the old neighborhood?" he asked, stepping back to study my face. Those sharp brown eyes that had coached 1,000 fighters hadn't missed much over the years. "Your ma said you made it big in real estate. I see she wasn't kidding." I glanced around the gym, taking in details I'd forgotten. The heavy bags still hung in the same spots, their leather surfaces worn smooth by generations of gloved fists. The ring in the center looked exactly as it had 2 decades ago, its canvas stained with the sweat and sometimes blood of countless sparring sessions. But there were things that were different too. Fewer pieces of equipment, empty spaces where machines used to be, and an overall feeling of tiredness. "Just visiting Mom," I said. "Thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing." Tony's expression shifted, and for the first time since I'd walked in, he looked away. "Ah, you know, same old, can't complain." But something in his tone told me that wasn't entirely true. I'd learned to read people in my business. It was the difference between closing deals and losing fortunes. Tony was holding something back. "Business good," I pressed gently. He shrugged, walking over to straighten a pair of boxing gloves that were already perfectly aligned. Well, times are tough, you know. Kids today, they got other things on their minds. Video games, cell phones, all that tech stuff. Not many want to learn the sweet science anymore." I nodded, but I could see there was more to it. The gym that had once been packed with kids from the neighborhood after school now felt almost empty. Only a couple of guys were working out, one on the heavy bag, Another doing sit-ups in the corner. When I was a regular here, you could barely move for all the activity. You remember why you first came here? Tony asked suddenly, settling onto a wooden stool near the ring. Your ma brought you in, said you were getting into fights at school, said you needed to learn to channel that anger somewhere positive. I remembered. God, did I remember. I'd been furious at everything. At my absent father, at our tiny apartment where the heat barely worked, at the kids at school who had things I could never afford. I'd gotten suspended twice for fighting, and Mom was at her wit's end. You told me that anger was like fire, I said, the memory coming back crystal clear. Said it could burn down everything around me, or I could learn to use it to forge something strong. Tony smiled, and for a moment, the years fell away from his face. You were a hell of a student, natural fighter, but more than that, you had heart. You had discipline once you learned how to focus it. We talked for another hour about old times, old fighters, old victories and defeats. But underneath the conversation, I could sense something was wrong. Tony kept glancing toward the office in the back, and once I heard him mutter something about paperwork under his breath. As I prepared to leave, I put my hand on his shoulder. Tony, if you ever need anything, and I mean anything, you call me, okay? You've got my word on that. He looked at me with those knowing eyes and nodded slowly. I appreciate that, Marcus. I really do. You always were a good kid. Walking back to my rental car, a sleek BMW that looked completely out of place on East Warren Avenue, I couldn't shake the feeling that this might be the last time I'd see the gym the way it was. There was something final in the way Tony had said goodbye, something that suggested endings rather than continuations. I didn't know it then, but I was right to be worried. Within 48 hours, I'd learned just how desperate Tony's situation really was, and I'd be faced with a choice that would force me to decide what kind of man I'd really become. The drive back to my mother's house took me through neighborhoods that told the story of Detroit's struggles and resilience. Abandoned houses stood next to others where families had clearly invested everything in keeping their piece of the American dream alive. It was a reminder that success and failure often lived side by side, separated only by luck, timing, and the choices we make when everything is on the line. As I pulled into Mom's driveway, I caught sight of my reflection in the rearview mirror. The successful businessman stared back at me, but behind those eyes, I could still see the angry kid who'd found salvation in the rhythm of hitting a heavy bag and the wisdom of an old fighter who'd cared enough to teach him a better way. I had no idea that in less than 2 days, both versions of myself would be put to the ultimate test. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. I was in my hotel room, halfway through my morning coffee and scanning emails, when my phone buzzed with a Detroit number I didn't recognize. Marcus, it's Tony. His voice was different, strained, defeated. In all the years I'd known him, I'd never heard Tony Ricci sound broken. What's wrong? I need to tell you something, kid. About the gym. He paused, and I could hear him taking a shaky breath. There's a developer, Richard Sterling. You might know the name. He's offering $800,000 for the building and the land. My stomach dropped. Sterling Development was notorious for tearing down Detroit's history to build luxury housing that locals couldn't afford. Tony, you can't seriously be considering? I don't have a choice. His voice cracked slightly. I'm $60,000 in debt, property taxes, equipment loans, utilities I couldn't pay last winter, the bank's threatening foreclosure next month. I set down my coffee cup, my hand trembling slightly. How long have you been struggling? 3 years, maybe 4. Kids stopped coming after the Johnson twins got shot outside. Parents got scared. My regular fighters, they grew up, moved away. The ones who stayed, he trailed off. Let's just say the neighborhood isn't what it used to be. Through the hotel window, I could see the Detroit skyline in the morning light, gleaming towers built on the hope of renewal. But I knew that hope hadn't reached every corner of the city yet. Sterling wants to close the deal by Friday, Tony continued. Says he's got investors lined up for a luxury apartment complex. Urban revitalization, he calls it. And the gym, gone. All of it. 40 years of history demolished for apartments that'll rent for $3,000 a month. Tony's laugh was bitter. Kids from the neighborhood won't even be able to afford to look at the place. I closed my eyes, seeing that empty lot where the pharmacy used to be. Soon, Tony's boxing gym would be just another memory of what East Warren Avenue used to be. I'm sorry, Marcus. I know what that place meant to you, what it meant to all of us. But I'm 70 years old, and I can't fight the math anymore. After we hung up, I sat in the silence of my hotel room, staring at the phone. $800,000. To Sterling, it was probably pocket change. To Tony, it was survival. But to me, it was the death of the place that had saved my life. I thought about that angry 15-year-old who'd walked through those doors 20 years ago. Where would he be now without Tony's patient guidance? Without that heavy bag to hit instead of other kids? Without learning that discipline and respect were more powerful than rage? By 8 a.m., I had made my decision. By 9 a.m., I was in my car driving back to East Warren Avenue. By 10 a.m., everything would change forever. I found Tony in his office staring at Sterling's contract with red-rimmed eyes. The same eyes that had watched me win my first tournament were now looking at the end of everything he'd built. Tony. He looked up startled. Marcus, what are you doing here? I pulled out my checkbook, something I rarely used anymore in the digital age. I want to make you an offer. Kid, I appreciate whatever you're thinking, but $1 million. Tony's mouth fell open. $1 million for the building and land, but with conditions. I sat down across from his cluttered desk. You stay as head trainer for life, with a guaranteed salary. The gym remains free for any kid who can afford it. And your name stays on the front, Tony's Boxing Gym, forever. His hands shook as he reached for the contract Sterling had left. Marcus, you don't understand what you're offering. This neighborhood, it's not what it used to be. You could lose everything. This place taught me something, Tony. Success isn't measured by what you accumulate. It's measured by what you give back to the people who made you who you are. Tony was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded on the desk. Finally, he looked up with tears in his eyes. Why? Because 20 years ago, you saved a kid who was headed nowhere fast. You taught him that anger could become strength, that discipline could become success. You never asked for anything in return. I leaned forward. Now I'm successful, and there are kids in this neighborhood who need exactly what you gave me. I'm not letting that disappear. 3 months later, I stood in the same spot, but everything was different. New equipment gleamed under updated lighting. Fresh paint covered the walls. 23 kids, ages 8 to 17, trained under Tony's watchful eye, some paying, some on scholarship, all learning the same lessons I'd learned decades before. Above the entrance, a bronze plaque read, "Where life champions are made." Sterling had called me an idiot. My business partners questioned my judgment, but watching a 10-year-old girl learn to wrap her hands properly while Tony explained why respect mattered more than power, I knew I'd made the smartest investment of my life. Some things are worth more than money. Some places are worth preserving, and some teachers are worth keeping forever. The gym that saved me was now saving others. That's what I call a return on investment.